other than the addiction itself, what people talked about with me most was their relationship problems.
Interesting.
So there was sort of this connection between what came first a lot of the time. Did the addiction affect the relationship, or was the relationship that they were having so problematic that they turned to substances for relief? And it's never clear, you can go way back in their history, but it comes down to relationships, maybe their relationships with their parents or whatever. So that's sort of what got me interested in the first place. That, and by the time people were ready to leave this facility usually after 30 days, I would spend time with them saying, what are you most nervous about going back out into the real world now that you aren't using substances? And it was always they were most nervous about how their relationships would go.
Welcome to Real Relationships, a real and honest podcast about the inside world of working with close relationships. I'm Alona Serpentine, a couples therapist, a sex therapist, and a relationship educator. Here, I draw the curtain on how close relationships work, interview other relationship professionals, share behind-the-scenes stories from my own practice, and also invite couples, families, and individuals of all kinds to speak about their journey and their real relationships. We as humans cannot live without others. This is why I hope that by sharing the stories and reality-tested information from real professionals and real clients, more people will enjoy fulfilling, supporting, and successful relationships. If you want to have one of those, or make your existing ones even better, and I can't imagine you are not, tune into our episodes released twice a month on Thursdays. And to stay up to date with what we have to share, subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform, or join our Facebook group, Real Relationships. Stay tuned and stay real. Welcome everyone. Again, it's Real Relationships, and today we're sitting once again on our yellow couch at Alice Place, practice for couples, individuals, and families. And I'm very happy to introduce my guest today. That is Kellie Walsh. Hi, Kellie.
Hi, Aliona.
And Kellie is not a novice to the therapeutic profession, but she is relatively new to couples counselling specifically. I met Kellie through working at Monash University, and it became a really lovely relationship. And I'm very happy to have Kellie now a team member at Alice Place as well. I know very little about Kellie, actually, which is funnily enough, given that we spent a fair bit of time together. And that's why I would like Kellie to start by sharing a little bit about herself. I know that she loves riding a motorbike off-road by the sound of things, so some very twisted roads. She also just shared with me that she used to do a short gig on live radio, which is fascinating. I mean, I'm sure Kellie has lots and lots of stories to tell. So once again, welcome, Kellie, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Where to start? So I'm sort of new back here in Australia. I've only been here 3 years. I came back in December 2020 in the middle of COVID, having lived in Washington, D.C. for the previous 30 years.
30 years?
Yeah,
oh, wow.
I know. It went by really fast, too fast. I had always wanted to get my master's in counselling, so the timing was just right.
So counselling is a new thing, but also not a new thing for you.
No, so before I worked here, I was a counsellor in an addiction rehabilitation facility. And that is sort of what led me here. So I did my graduate diploma in counselling and then started that job and then decided to keep going with my master's. Yeah.
And as far as I remember, you also have some social science background as well?
That's right. I studied psychology in undergrad at George Mason University in Washington.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was good. I really would like to have stuck with it at the time, but I had other things going on in my life. I had a young daughter, and it was just a time issue. And in retrospect, I don't think I was ready for it at that age. I was still in my 20s. I think I'm a better counsellor having had that extra couple of decades of life experience. I mean, that's just a personal thing. I'm sure there's lots of young therapists that are great, but I don't think I would have been as good at it when I was that age.
I actually tend to agree with that. I think one of the prerequisites for being a counselor is life experience on one side, but at the same time, on the other side, we also want to be curious. We want to be, we want to dive into each client's situation and try to explore it together with them. And at times, life experience can be very useful because it makes it quicker for you to connect the dots because you understand what they've been through. But sometimes it also can be a little bit limiting because we start seeing things from one perspective, from our own perspective, while sometimes when somebody is quite fresh to, let's say, to the adulthood as well. We do have some counselors, as you know, who are a little bit younger, on the younger side, and they seem to be really passionate about the cases because they just follow their clients. So I think either side of the age spectrum has its benefits to a certain extent.
Yeah, for sure.
So you started psychology back then in Washington, and what happened next?
I did something strange, which some people think of as even as backwards. So there was a little loophole in the laws at the time. And I was able to get a license to be a hairdresser.
Was it a legally complicated thing?
No, it just meant that I could do the training myself, teach myself how to do it as long as I could pass the exam. So it's a 2-day exam. One part is the theoretical side and one part is the practical side. So they decided that you didn't have to check the box of doing 1,500 hours of schooling as long as you could pass the exam. So I taught myself how to pass the exam.
Oh my gosh. What a great story. How did you do it? How did you teach yourself hairdressing?
It was a little bit cheating. So I worked in a hair salon for several years when I was young. And I just watched and listened and learned. So I had been doing my friend's hair for years at that point. So I wasn't a complete novice. Yeah. And then my goal from doing that was to open my own place. I really didn't want to work in a salon where there were 8 other hairdressers jammed into a small room with hairdryers going all day. I knew ahead of time that wouldn't suit me or my personality. I wanted the human connection part, the part where I got to interact with people. And, you know, it was helpful having that psychology background. You know, not that I was diagnosing my clients, but it was helpful in trying to understand people and being empathic towards them. And it worked both ways too, because, you know, I think in the end I added up that I did 38,000 hours of one-on-one time with clients. And that just exposes you to a lot of different personalities and age groups. So, yeah, it really helped me grow as a person. It was good.
Amazing. And I'm also thinking that, of course, those ridiculous amount of hours that you just named, how many? 38,000?
38,000 hours.
Wow, 38,000 one-on-one hours, where you have to understand the person's needs, where you have to engage with, where you need to monitor how they are doing. So this is an amazing therapeutic practice as well. So in a way, you have been already in that therapeutic space and therapeutic training mode for all those years.
Yeah, and it's funny because the psychology training really didn't teach me anything yet at that point about really being a good listener. It was more about the different disorders and the theories, the models. But that time I spent as a hairdresser taught me to be a good listener because people really responded to that. I picked that up really quickly, just sort of innately, that some hairdressers, people would tell me that they'd had hairdressers in the past that just yap the whole way through the appointment. And so I learned really quickly to just being a good listener. That's what they were looking for. They wanted somebody to listen to them. So that turned out to be really good training for me.
For your current counseling profession?
Yeah, as it turned out, yeah.
So very often, you know, when we go to a hairdresser, it is a little bit like a therapeutic experience because obviously the person is very close to you. They are doing something with your hair, so actually touching you as well. So they are in your intimate space. So how do you feel being a hairdresser connects with being a counselor? If you were a little bit more explicit, I guess, about the similarities of those works.
Well, in part, I guess it's about building relationships, right? Like you said, it's an intimate experience, touching someone's head and hair. Women feel very vulnerable when they come into that space, especially if they've had bad experiences. If you have any woman knows, if you have a bad haircut, that's months of distress sometimes. It really is. And some people have difficult hair, and so they've had these repeated bad experiences with hairdressers. So I had a lot of women who were middle-aged, so they'd had 20 years of having bad experiences. So it's almost like trauma into the space. And so you have to be
they're very sensitive about their hair.
That's right. You have to be very delicate about the way you handle any changes that you're going to make, because they assume that something's going to go wrong because they've had all these bad experiences. So yeah, it just sort of taught me to sort of slow down and really listen to their experience and understand where things had gone wrong in the past. It wasn't always a good thing for business, because I would book someone for an hour and then I'd spend an hour just talking to them and I hadn't even touched their hair. But I worked it out over time and it was fine. But yes, it really did help me sort of understand that to build that kind of trusting relationship sometimes just takes time, and really listening carefully to what they're saying.
Yes, again, that active listening, which is the foundation of pretty much any therapeutic profession or any helping profession. How do you know how to help if you don't know or don't understand what they're dealing with, right, Kellie?
Yeah.
So you came back to Australia, you said 3 years ago?
Yeah.
What was the reason, if you don't mind?
Sure. Both my parents got sick around the same time. My dad had a really long-term illness that was coming to a head, and my mum was starting to show signs of cognitive decline. So it was a tricky situation. And my dad did pass away, and that left my mother who was already having some cognitive decline alone. So that's why I ended up coming back permanently.
Yeah, to help and support them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a tumultuous time, I can imagine, for the family. Yeah, it's quite a brave thing to do after 30 years, to leave everything that you have created over there in the States and then come back to Australia.
Yeah, mostly I just miss my daughter.
She's still in the US, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Where does she live in the US?
She lives in Washington now. She moved back. Her dad and I kind of ganged up on her when COVID started, because she was living in New York City, and she moved back to Washington. But I think she was ready to do that. I'm kidding.
But I think you're going to see her fairly soon.
Yes, in about 2 months, yeah.
You probably can't wait.
Yes, I can't wait.
I can't wait. Okay, so you had heaps and heaps of practice of what we call counseling micro skills during your time as a hairdresser, and now you're working as a couples counselor. You said before mainly they were individuals, mainly middle-aged women, and now it's this transition into the relationship space. How do you find it?
Actually, surprisingly comfortable. I thought it was going to be a lot more nerve-wracking trying to sort of make that bond with two people simultaneously. And I'm not saying that it's easy. It often isn't, but I like it a lot. I see how people get along is so important to, I don't know, I guess their daily happiness and well-being. So it's a lot more fulfilling, I guess, than I realized it was going to be.
Right. So you're enjoying it by the sound of things.
Yeah, I really am.
And I want to really ask about bits that you enjoy most. But before I do that, why couples counseling? Like, it's quite a challenging modality, as you probably know at times, and it has certain challenges that individual counseling may not have. But what drew you to trying couples counseling rather than individual counseling?
I think when I was working with addiction, other than the addiction itself, what people talked about with me most was their relationship problems.
Interesting.
So there was sort of this connection between what came first a lot of the time. Did the addiction affect the relationship, or was the relationship that they were having so problematic that they turned to substances for relief? And it's never clear, you can go way back in their history, but it comes down to relationships, maybe their relationships with their parents or whatever. So that's sort of what got me interested in the first place. That, and by the time people were ready to leave this facility usually after 30 days, I would spend time with them saying, what are you most nervous about going back out into the real world now that you aren't using substances? And it was always they were most nervous about how their relationships would go.
And what do you think they were anxious about in regards to their relationships?
Well, in a lot of the cases, they hadn't really tried to have a relationship without the substance use.
Substance use was in a way the third party in their relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it was sort of nerve-wracking to them. It was like starting the relationship over from scratch a lot of the time. They'd never dealt with their partner without being under the influence of a substance. So it was scary and intimidating to them.
How that would go now without using any substances.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Interesting. And that kind of stimulated your interest in couples and in relationships in general, right? And I'm also curious that now being a couples counselor and actually seeing how relationships play out there in real world, why do you think even such things like addiction, they are so influenced by relationship?
I guess because if you're not happy in the relationships that you're in, it just makes everything else more difficult. If you have a fight with your partner, your whole day is ruined,
Or sometimes a week.
Yeah.
Or a month.
Or a month, exactly. So I can just see how important that is. Just, sometimes it seems like they're small things, but if they go on for a long period of time, then those bad habits get harder to break. So it's really interesting to work with people and see how much progress they make in a short period of time just by breaking down those communication issues and sort of improving on them.
So yes, it is something that I often say that one of the most rewarding parts about being a couples counselor, that you can see change pretty much in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
Sometimes the couple comes in a very bad mood at the very beginning of the session, and in 90 minutes, they are potentially even hugging and kissing and just being much more aligned and happier with each other.
Yeah, it's really sweet and moving a lot of the time when you see that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in terms of something that you mentioned before, and also along the lines of what we're just saying, so far, what are you finding to be the most fulfilling, the most rewarding part of being a couples counselor?
There's something about having parents of young kids, like young children in here who are worried that their negative interactions with each other are affecting their children. And I really admire people that are proactive that way. They recognize and are humble enough to say, hey, this is not going to be good for the kids, and come in for that reason. And so it's just really nice to be a part of that, to help them start to lower the temperature of their behaviors and interact in a kinder, gentler way with each other, because that's going to be good for the whole family. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think. And just something that, in case our listeners are wondering about that, very often when we have families and they come and see us and would like to focus on one child specifically for their behavioral issues, or maybe something else is going on with the children, it's pretty much always the relationship of the parents that determines what's going on in the family. So, of course, seeing couples that come here proactively trying to not only better their own relationship, but also the lives of their children, this is very rewarding. And this is quite admirable as well for us to see. And being able to help them in the best possible professional capacity is, of course, a huge privilege.
Yeah. And that, to circle back to working with addiction too, I don't think I ever worked with someone who their relationship with their parents or their parents' behaviors didn't play a very specific role in their addiction. So it's funny that sort of now is reflecting back in the work that I'm doing here.
Yeah, so you kind of see it a generation prior, or maybe even 2 generations prior to where the issues start happening.
Yeah, that's right.
100%. I totally agree that very often we actually need to go back, or sometimes we need to go forward within the family levels to understand how to fix the whole situation. So is there maybe a specific case, maybe a specific couple, obviously without naming anyone, that you find so far to be one of your best couples counseling moments?
Yeah, there's a couple that I'm still working with, and they had a child later in life. And so that has its own challenges, because the older you are when you have a child, the more ingrained your own habits are. And they both recognize this and really sort of want to improve their relationship and their own interactions so they can be a better parent. But the way that they care about their child is really touching to see. And I enjoy working with them for that reason.
So you identify also as a parent with them, acting in the best interests of the child.
Yeah, I really do. Yeah. You see so much neglect, or you hear about it, in the media and things like that, that you start to get this impression that people are sometimes a little bit more selfish than they should be as parents. So when you meet people who just so genuinely and obviously care about their kids' well-being and sort of prioritize that, it's really genuinely moving.
Absolutely. I think I totally agree with that so far from all the, I don't know how many hundreds of couples that I've seen, I can't remember a single couple that didn't care about their children. I know there are some exemptions from this, and there are, of course, unfortunately, circumstances when we are not the best versions of ourselves and when we don't act in the best interest of our children. But I would say the overwhelming majority is trying to do their best, all things considering, as parents.
Absolutely. And that's sometimes, ironically, sort of what goes wrong in relationships, because one will sort of focus on the child a lot more because they just want to do such a good job as a parent that sometimes then they start to neglect their partner. And it's so tricky because you understand where they're coming from. They're trying so desperately to do a good job, and then the relationship suffers. So trying to help them find that balance is really rewarding,
So that's what's rewarding for you. And what do you find challenging?
As therapists, we're always trying to not bring our own things into the room. But sometimes the way people behave can be a little triggering to me, and that can be tough sometimes. Usually you go and talk to your supervisor about it and you work it out. But it can be difficult when you see people really treating each other badly and not recognizing their own behaviors, because then it makes it tougher for you too as the therapist to try and get them to change those behaviors if they don't recognize it in the first place. And so that's always when it gets really hard.
And how do you navigate those hard parts?
It depends. Take it gently mostly, because usually that person is feeling a little intimidated by having to go through the process. So sometimes it helps just to give them a little bit of space so that they don't feel so threatened by what you're requiring of them, which is to change sort of the way that they behave towards their partner. It's tricky, but yes, I would say that mostly I try to just give them some space.
Right. And see how that unfolds in a gentle way rather than forcing it in a way that maybe is more comfortable for you, but maybe is not right for them.
Yeah. I mean, I had a situation recently where I thought it would be better if I saw them each individually a couple of times, just because one of them was not really making any progress in terms of recognizing how their own behavior was contributing to the problem. And that was a way for me to just address it with them one-on-one, and then helping their partner understand why they were having such trouble sort of owning up and recognizing their role in it. And I think that worked out pretty well, and we've been able to move on.
Yeah, sometimes we have to maybe take a step aside or take a step back so we can move forward.
Yeah.
And very often, just from my experience, and I'm sure you probably also have couples like this, partners are not necessarily at the same level, either emotionally or sometimes maybe even reflectively. They haven't really done the work yet that the other partner maybe has already done. And then we just have to take it slowly and make sure that they catch up with each other.
Yeah, that's so true. Often one person has done a lot of therapy of their own, and so they know how the process is going to go. They know there's some hard work involved in therapy. They have to take a look at what they bring to the picture. They have to be able to look at the past and sort of be willing to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. And the other person's got no experience with that. So it really can be tricky that way.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. So I guess I want to ask a couple of questions that are stepping away a little bit from the couples and more into what it's like to work as a couples therapist, and especially in a group practice like Ellie's place. So how do you find working in a team of other couples counselors?
Well, I've had a particularly pleasant experience since I've been working here, so I'm probably a little bit biased. People have been really kind to me, just checking in on me, and just the short conversations we have sometimes are really reassuring. Like, it's reassuring to know other people are going through the same thing.
You mean other therapists?
Yeah. And it's nice too, because everybody cares so much about the work that they're doing. And so these little conversations that we have, it just makes me feel better about humanity. Have these conversations. I know that sounds corny, but it's true. Yeah.
So you have this new faith in humanity.
I do. I really do. Yeah.
Any gossip that you would like to share about that maybe listeners would have no idea that this happens in a couples counseling practice? Something that maybe an outsider would find a little bit surprising?
Oh, that we worry about you guys. We really do. We're not supposed to take our work home with us, but sometimes we can't help it. And so, if we get here early in the morning and we're chatting with each other, it's nice to know that you're not the only one that sometimes takes your work home with you and thinks, what could I have done differently? What could I have said to make that person sort of see where we're going or what's going on? Yeah, it just sort of humanizes the whole thing.
Wonderful. And maybe if there is a new counselor listening out there, or maybe already an experienced counselor who really would like to step into the couples counseling world, what would be your piece of advice for them, Kellie?
I guess, I do reflect on how I would not have been able to do this when I'm young. And that doesn't imply that other young therapists couldn't do this. But I think I would have found some people's behaviors more intimidating when I was young, because when couples first come in, their sort of explanations of what's going wrong in the relationship can get really heated. And I can see how when I was younger, I would have been quite intimidated by that. So my advice maybe would be to have some exposure to a lot of different people who may not be on their best behavior all the time. So maybe if you've worked in mental health support work or worked in a community-based service where you get people who have different types of mental health problems and addictions and, behavioral issues that can be quite confronting, at least that gives you a little bit of experience sort of managing people when they're not having their best days,
Yeah, so it's about being a little bit more prepared that what happens in the room can be a little bit tricky at times and maybe quite emotionally charged. So being able to be okay with that turbulence is something that is quite important.
Yeah, and I know I have certainly had friends back when I was young who would have been able to do that anyway. They just had very calm personalities and weren't easily triggered by other people's behaviors. Maybe they just had particularly good childhoods, or that was just their natural disposition. Yeah, exactly. Or that was just their natural disposition. So I see how it's possible. But I think some of the years that I spent just sort of getting to know different personalities was good preparation.
Fantastic. I think it's a really wise piece of advice, because one thing that I often share with students who are interested in working with couples is that it's like, you drive a motorbike, right?
Yeah.
I say to them, you've done individual counseling. So individual counseling is a little bit like riding a bicycle in terms of its energy and its velocity to a certain extent. It's a little bit gentler. But when you have two people, especially two people in distress who don't really know you, and you are a third wheel coming into their relationship, their natural defense systems are much more heightened. So the energy is much more unpredictable. And it's like you're driving a very powerful motorbike on a very twisty, windy road.
Good metaphor.
And you really need to be constantly on the ball, constantly watching what's coming around the corner, what just happened with that, I don't know, wheel, or what happened here, because it's so unpredictable.
Yeah. And people can come in quite defensive because often, when people are having relationship problems, their families get involved or their friends get involved and say things sometimes that make the situation worse. But in other words, they feel judged. They feel like already like you're going to judge them. So they're very defensive when they come in. They think you as the counselor are going to side with the other person. Everybody thinks that. And so it takes a while to sort of get them to lower their defenses sometimes. And you have to be patient and not take it personally.
Absolutely. And another thing that you just reminded me of, Kellie, is that couples counseling is a process, right? It does take time, especially because of those defenses that people naturally have. They can't just become nice humans after 90 minutes with you. How long typically you would say it takes for a couple to get better to wherever, or to get where they want to be?
Well, I don't think realistically anyone could do it in less than maybe a half a dozen sessions, but probably more. Just today, I had someone say, I don't understand why we need to come. Like, you're telling us that he was paraphrasing, but basically he said, you're telling us that we just need to be nicer to one another. And I said, you're sort of right that way. But what you're telling me is for the last 15 years, you haven't been nice to each other and you've tried everything to break that habit and you haven't. So you can't expect 20 years or 15 years of sort of niggling at each other to be undone in a few sessions. That's not realistic. It takes time. I mean, I think it's good if you take 10 years of having bickering back and forwards and you can make improvements in a half a dozen sessions. I mean, that's amazing. Think about that. In 3 months, you're getting along with each other better and your life improves substantially because you're not stressed because you're fighting all the time. I mean, when you put it that way, it seems like a cheap, easy thing to do to improve your life,
Absolutely. And obviously, bad relationships, as you mentioned earlier, lead to many other life concerns. We talked about addiction, but it can be also physical health. It can be,
oh, for sure.
It can be just general levels of misery and depression all going up and being affected by poor relationships. I have a client, this is just sharing a little bit from my side, who I saw just before we recorded this podcast. And she's basically a walking collection of different medical conditions because of something that happened about 6 years ago within the relationship. And it has triggered lots and lots of different medical issues because she felt so wounded, so hurt by what happened. And for some people, it can be that they lose trust in the world. But for other people, it can be that they suddenly have medical conditions that they never had before. Our whole body, our whole kind of human existence is all one system.
Yeah.
So if something gets broken in one area, then inevitably it will affect us everywhere else.
Yeah, I often think we don't need people working counselling don't need to read all the science on the mind-body connection, because it's really perfectly evident when you start counselling people, that connection. I think the thing that I hear most often when couples first come in is that they're tired. They describe this exhaustion that they're feeling with this constant battle that they've got going on and how much they've tried and it failed. And it becomes literally physically exhausting. They're just done feeling exhausted.
100% agree with that. Kellie, last question. What do you do for yourself outside of couple sessions that re-energizes and replenishes your batteries so that you can help your couples?
Well, I do like to ride my motorbike on windy country roads. But I'm a big bushwalker. I go on big, long bushwalks whenever I can. That's by far my favourite thing to do.
Any good suggestions for other hikers listening?
Oh, we have so much here in the Dandenong Mountains and the Warburton area. You don't have to go very far outside of Melbourne to have world-class hiking trails. We're really quite lucky.
Amazing. I think I really would like to come and do a hike one day. I also really love hiking.
Oh, you should.
But yes, something I need to get back into. So hikes and riding a motorbike. That's Kellie's recipe for self-care. Thank you so much, Kellie. It was a pleasure having you here on our Real Relationship podcast, our first other team member of Alice Place as well, and a budding couples counselor. Thanks, Kellie.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Real Relationships podcast. For more reality-tested relationship information, visit our Facebook group, Real Relationships. Or if you have a question or a guest suggestion for me to interview next, email me at podcast@alionaserpentine.com.au. Stay tuned and stay real.